So now that we've discussed the terrestrial biomes, we're going to talk about the aquatic biomes now. So of course aquatic, as I mentioned earlier, is your water biomes. And there are two types, either fresh or marine. Of course marine is going to be salt water. So they are characterized by how deep they are, their depth, their temperature, and the chemicals in them. So that would be the salt and oxygen dissolved in the water. So like I said, fresh versus salt water is pretty much what we think of. So, freshwater biomes. So, your first type, freshwater biomes, they are characterized by having very low salt concentration. So, they're going to have a less than 1% salt concentration. So, they will still have usually very small amounts of salt, but not a lot. So, there's two types there's flowing water and then non flowing or stagnant or standing water. Okay, if you're talking about fresh water. So your flowing water, freshwater biomes are going to be rivers and streams. So rivers and streams are going to have animals adapted to living there. So rivers and streams are going to have a current. So the plant life, where the water is fast moving, there won't be a lot of plant life because they can't sit down roots. The plant life is going to grow where the current is moving slower, okay? Or like towards the edges. Then your animals are going to have adaptations. They're going to have hooks or suckers, and they're going to have very streamlined bodies. So the fish might not be real fat, but they might be kind of long, so they can easily go with or against the water current. So here are some pictures of some flowing water, freshwater biomes. Okay, so then you have the standing water or stagnant water, fresh water. So this is going to be lakes and ponds. The water is going to be relatively still. Now it may not be perfectly still because it's still going to be circulated. It's going to be circulated by wind, wind and the animals. Okay, so if you put your arm in your bathtub while it's filling up with water, you can kind of circulate the water with your arm and kind of move it around. And so animals, fish, as they swim, it's going to help circulate. And then wind is going to circulate it too, kind of more the top, but still. So as it circulates, it's going to distribute the heat, the oxygen, and the nutrients in the water. So if you think about like a swimming pool, you might notice that kind of towards the bottom of the pool is colder. Anyway, so in standing water biomes, usually your phytoplankton are going to be your producers. So these are algae, and they're usually the base of the food chain. Then you have zooplankton. Zoo means animal, okay? So they're still very tiny, usually microscopic, but they're animals that eat the phytoplankton. Okay, so they eat the algae, the phytoplankton that serves as the base of the food chain. And then, bigger things eat those. So here are some examples of lakes and ponds. And then I have some pictures of your microscopic plankton and both zooplankton and phytoplankton. So if you think about Happy Feet, the krill, and how they eat the plankton, and it's bioluminescent and it lights up. I can't remember if that was the first Happy Feet or the second one. There might even be a third one. I can't remember. So then you have your saltwater biomes. So saltwater biomes are going to have 3% salt or more. So this is going to include your oceans, which in the ocean you'll find the intertidal zone, the coral reefs, and this also includes estuaries. So in these saltwater biomes, they will be deeper. So they're usually, like in the ocean, there's going to be an aphotic zone. So remember, A means without, and photic is light. So this is the area where it's so deep that light cannot penetrate. Okay, so that's about 100 meters down. We mentioned that before. So it's always dark. So it's so deep that sunlight does not penetrate. So there will be no photosynthesis that deep in the aphotic zone. Okay, so they rely on chemosynthetic autotrophs to be your base of the food chain there. So your coastal ocean is going to be the area from the outer continental shelf to the low tide mark. So the low tide mark, basically, that's going to be like where the water starts. And the continental shelf, if you've ever like been out on the beach, so like here's the sand, okay, and then here's where the water starts. So the water will go, and then all of a sudden there's a big drop off. That is the continental shelf. Is that drop off? So anyway, in this area, you're going to have sunlight penetrating. So there'll be lots of producers in here. This is where seaweed will be, kelp. So therefore, you'll have a lot of small animals, small fish, minnows. You'll have sea snails, sea urchins, and this is where seals and whales will come in to eat these small animals. So then you have the intertidal zone. So it's just what it says. Inter means between. Well, between is right here. So it's between your low and high tide marks. So basically, if it's low tide, then the organisms that live here might not be under the water. And then if they're high tide, then they might be under the water. And they're also going to have to deal with the crashing waves, a strong current. The temperature changes because if you're in the water versus out of the water, you're going to be hotter or colder, and dealing with sunlight or no sunlight. So organisms that live here are very adapted to all these extreme changes. A lot of the times they're permanently attached to rocks, or they have something called tube feet or suckers that help them cling. So like a sand dollar or a starfish, starfish is a sea star, same thing. They'll have these little tube feet that help them kind of dig into the sand. Or they'll have like shells where they can go inside their shell, like crabs. And so, or crabs, clams. So they live in this intertidal zone. Okay, so here is a picture. So if you take a look here, I want to show you a few things. Okay, I like this picture better. Okay, so here, first off, this is going to be your continental shelf. Okay, that's that continental shelf. And this is your intertidal zone. Okay, so this would be low tide. And this would be high tide. And you see the water here is kind of in between low and high tide. So anyway, if you look, you can see, let me make it to where you can see better. If you look, you can see all these organisms living. They've zoomed in because the intertidal zone has lots of organisms, lots of diversity. So you got a lot of plant life, and because there's a lot of plant life, there's a lot of animal life there. And so what will happen is you'll have some big fish, and they'll kind of just swoop in and then come back out, and swoop in and come back out. And so this area right here is where a lot of your shark attacks will happen. Anyway, I know I just made that ugly, but so anyway, so if you look down here, you can see where it's very dark. You'll get into the aphotic zone, and lots of organisms live up by the surface. And then up here, this just shows you some different shores and high tide versus low tide line, and just showing how the water gets deeper. So all this that we just talked about will be the coastal ocean. So, coral reefs. I mentioned when we were talking about the terrestrial biomes that the coral reef was the rainforest of the ocean. So, the tropical rainforest was the most biodiverse terrestrial biome, and the coral reef is the most biodiverse aquatic biome. Okay, so they're extremely biodiverse because they're going to be no deeper than 40 meters. Okay, and they're also in warm water, so that means there's going to be more photosynthesis there. Okay, so more photosynthesis means more producers means more consumers. So coral reefs are formed by coral. Okay, and corals are actually animals, so they're very tiny cnidarians. So a cnidarian is an animal that can sting you. So jellyfish are cnidarians. Anyway, sea anemones are cnidarians. But anyway, so these corals, they secrete calcium carbonate, and that builds up over a very long time and forms a reef. And the reef, like I said, there's lots of photosynthesis here because it's not very deep, and so lots of organisms live there. And so this is like the brightest part of the ocean. And so there's lots of colorful fish there, and there's sea stars and sea anemones. And of course, the first thing that I think about is Finding Nemo. Sorry, I can't. I was trying to put Nemo. It's Nemo. You know how to spell Nemo. So this is a picture of a coral reef, and so we've definitely seen this in lots of movies, not just Finding Nemo. So estuaries. We actually live in an area where we have an estuary. Estuaries are also called brackish water. Okay, that's what kind of more local people call it, more of a layman's term. So this is where freshwater rivers and streams meet the ocean. So in our case, where all the local rivers meet the Gulf. So on our beaches, the Mississippi Sound is considered an estuary. So the Mississippi Sound is the area between the coast and the barrier islands. So this is an estuary. So estuaries are extremely important for environments, and this is why they made a big deal about the oil spill that happened several years back, and like hurricanes and stuff, because it can mess up this estuary environment. So it's brackish water because the salinity is between fresh and salt water. So if you remember, fresh water was less than 1%, and oceans, salt water, is going to be more than 3%. So fresh waters are going to be, estuaries are going to be between 1 and 3%. It's going to be, their salinity is going to be between fresh and salt water. So the reason why estuaries are so important for ecosystems is because they serve as a nursery for a lot of your saltwater fish. Okay, so if you've ever been fishing in one of our local rivers and you've caught a shark, it's because the shark, you're probably getting close to the Gulf, and the shark, it's usually not a big shark, it's usually going to be more of a baby shark, or, maybe 2 feet, 3 feet at the most. But anyway, so these big fish, or these saltwater fish, lay their eggs in the estuary area. Another reason is because only certain organisms can be found here. So algae, seaweed, anywhere you see marsh grass, and we have a lot of that around here, is going to be estuary. And so this is where oysters, shrimp, worms, crabs, lots of birds live in this area. So lots of organisms are going to live in an estuary. And like I said, can be found in our area. Okay, so these pictures should look very familiar to our local area because this is an estuary. So that brings us to ecological succession. So we've wrapped up biomes now, and we're going to talk about ecological succession. So ecological succession just describes predictable changes in an ecosystem. So these changes are very predictable. Okay, now ecosystems are always changing. Sometimes it's natural causes like weather and volcanoes, and sometimes it's from human actions like strip mining, deforestation, or whatnot. So anyway, this shows you a picture of how ecological succession occurs. Okay, so first we'll have lichens, your pioneer species, lichens. They first colonize an area. Then you'll have grasses and ferns. And then you'll have kind of larger plants. Then you'll get shrubs and bushes. And eventually you'll get softwood trees and then hardwood trees. Okay, so you're basically going to get more and more plant life in ecological succession. So the first way that you see succession is through primary succession. Primary means first, okay? So the big thing you need to know about primary succession is you start with no soil, okay? Not a lot of situations occur to totally get rid of the soil, but one of those, and the biggest example we see, is after a volcanic eruption. So after a volcanic eruption, it explodes, and any soil was exploded away, and all you're left with is rocks. Okay, so you have no soil, you pretty much just have rocks. Okay, and we know rocks are non-living. So what has to happen is a pioneer species has to grow, and that'll be the first living thing to grow in that area. And usually this is lichens. So lichens are a mutualistic relationship between algae and fungus. And so what happens is the lichen forms on the bare rock, and over time it breaks down the rock into soil. Okay, so lichens are a common pioneer species. And so once you get soil, then you can, seeds will be brought in, and then you can get plants and animals, because you got to have some plants to get some animals. So as the soil accumulates, you'll get some grasses and some small animals like worms, and eventually you'll get shrubs, and then eventually you'll get trees and bigger animals. So primary succession, you start with no soil, usually after a volcano, and your pioneer species are usually lichens, and they have to make the soil by turning the rock, breaking it down, and making it into soil. So here would be just showing you succession, how you would start with some sort of disturbance, and then you would get grasses, and then shrubs, and then small trees, and eventually the climax community, the forest. So secondary succession is going to occur when you have soil. The soil is not removed. Okay, so because the soil's not removed, there will be some dormant seeds that are present in the soil. So a lot of the times the example we see is after a fire, or maybe a hurricane, or some sort of erosion, a landslide or something. So secondary succession, something has existed there. And so the soil is still there, and it still has seeds present. So you're not starting from scratch. You don't have to make the soil. So the seeds will just grow, and then once you get your plant life, then you'll start seeing more animals, and then the plant life will grow and grow and grow, and the animals will bring in seeds themselves to grow more plant life. So the last community is always the climax community. It does not reach a climax community until you have hardwood trees. Okay, so that would be like maple and oak trees. So climax community is not going to change very much, but they can still be affected by those exotic non-native species we discussed before. So you're going to reach climax community much faster if you're dealing with secondary succession than primary succession. Obviously. And so this is a great picture, and you're going to see a similar picture on your test. Maybe, not exactly this, obviously, but so if you look here, we have primary succession. Okay, so primary succession, if I was to start here, then all I have is rocks. And then I have my pioneer species come in, so that's going to be like lichens, even mosses. And then I'm going to break down the soil, rocks into soil. Eventually I'll get soil. Okay, and then you're going to have your grasses and herbs and shrubs grow. And then eventually you'll have your softwoods, and then your hardwoods come with the climax community. Okay, so if there was a fire and you started kind of here where you had soil, so this space is going to reach climax community faster than this space would if you were looking on a timeline. Ponds. So one thing is that ponds are very small bodies of water, and one thing that we need to know is that ponds will never reach a climax community. So what happens with a succession in a pond is that you'll have water plants begin to grow in a pond. Remember, ponds aren't very deep comparatively. So your water plants will grow, and then as runoff, water runs off into the pond, sediment and dirt will slowly fill in the pond. Okay, so sediment will slowly over time fill in the pond, and then the plant's roots will anchor into the soil. So you'll get more and more water plants, and more sediment will grow, and it'll usually kind of start from the outside in. And so eventually the pond will be totally filled in with soil. And then once it gets totally filled in with soil, then you'll have more grasses and trees there. So this is showing you succession in a pond. So this would be near a beach, a pond near the beach. And so it has sandy borders with no vegetation. And then after a couple of years, so if you're just, so that's where we started here. So we started here, okay, and then we're here now. Oop. We're here now. So after 2 years, the pond is now ringed by low vegetation. So just some plant life coming in on the edges because there's more and more dirt coming in. And then after about 50 years, then you get more and more plant life, and you get more, and then you get trees coming in. Okay, and so then there's only a small bit of water left, and eventually, after a couple hundred years, the area will become a meadow. Okay, and that's why it never reaches a climax community, because it becomes a meadow. So you typically won't have those hardwood trees that are required with a climax community. You would have softwood trees, but not the hardwoods. And this is also should look familiar to you from your packet. So if you're looking at succession in this pond, you're going to see that pond B would be first, okay? Because one, it's the deepest, and you don't have anything filling in the dirt here, okay? And so pond B would be first, okay? Then you would have pond C, okay? Because it's starting to fill in here at the bottom, okay? And then you would have pond A, so that would be third. Whoops, I clicked on the wrong thing. That would be third, because you see it's filling in more here. And then pond D would be fourth, because it's barely got any water left, okay? And it's filling in mostly with dirt. So that concludes this entire unit. And so I hope that this was helpful. Again, if you have any questions, y'all just let me know. And good luck.